All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Guy Lancaster, and I serve as the editor of the Online Encyclopedia, which is a project of the Central Arkansas Library System. I would like to welcome you to tonight's discussion with Dr. Carmen Lanos Williams, titled Inevitable Insult and Humiliation, Black Women Writers of Arkansas. This lecture is one of 3 such lectures that are a part of the Monday Matriarchs series hosted by the Central Arkansas Library System. I will post a link to all of these lectures at Cal's in the chat. Well, I've already done so. And if you want to visit the research room of the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art for your own historical or genealogical inquiries, we are open to the public Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 10 to 5. If you enjoy this talk tonight, you might want to tune in on March 18 when Arkansas Sounds will be presenting a tribute to Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And I'll put a link to that event in the chat also. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Carmen Lanos Williams, is an assistant professor of English and Heritage Studies at Arkansas State University. Her recent dissertation, Arkansas and the African American Imaginary, A Rhetoric of Place, examines placemaking in the published work of African Americans in Arkansas and in memoirs and fiction depicting coming of age in Arkansas. Her research is particularly concerned with how marginalized Arkansans shape public perception of Arkansas as both a real and imagined place. Following this presentation, we will have a brief Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams, it's all yours.
Thank you, Guy. I hope you guys can hear me okay. I want to say thank you to Guy and to the Central Arkansas Library System for inviting me tonight to talk about my research, Inevitable Insult and Humiliation, in honor of Women's History Month. And so I want you to know that my presentation tonight is extracted from research that I've done on Black writers from Arkansas, but I'm honing in for tonight's discussion and in honor of Women's History Month on African American women from Arkansas. So tonight I'll give you an overview of how the project developed. I'll talk to you a little bit about my findings, and hopefully I'll be able to have some discussion with you at the end of the presentation. So the idea that I had for looking at African American writers comes in part in response to the work of Brooks Blevins, an Ozark historian. He did a cultural study of artifacts from Arkansas, and he sought to explain how the hillbilly mythos became representative of the whole state of Arkansas for the nation. Here's a map of the Ozark region, and I'm from the Delta region. And so the artifacts that he used, Blevins used in his research, did not take into consideration things that were being produced from the Delta, or really anything that wasn't linked to the Ozarks directly. The Ozarks happens to be one of the least diverse areas in the state, and historically it has been. And so I went looking in places where he didn't look, and so we could get a different picture of how marginal people are creating images of Arkansas in their works and cultural products. So the problem as I see it is that elite voices have dominated the conversation on who or what Arkansas is. And the literature review that I've done that was produced by various scholars and even people who have traveled to Arkansas, a lot of the people who are the harshest critics of Arkansas are outsiders, people who are not acquainted with the ways and things of Arkansas, the ways of being. I mentioned the lack of diversity. I also mentioned the regional emphasis, but there's also a kind of default whiteness that falls to perceptions of what Arkansas is. And so I'd like to address that on tonight with some of the literature that I've been reading. So Because of structural racism, Black people often have a perspective that is different than others. That perspective is informed by personal experience and shared experiences through race, gender, and all sorts of other ways of identification. But when we shift perspectives, we get a different understanding. Take, for example, this moment, this cultural moment when Bill Clinton, who was a presidential candidate, appeared on the Arsenio Hall show wearing Ray-Bans, jamming with the band on his saxophone, and playing a solo rendition of Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. Bill Clinton did something at that moment that no other politician prior had done in the way that he was engaging the audience. But that problematized the way that people came to understand who he was. So the national press hears Arkansas and they try to frame him as a hillbilly, which doesn't quite fit because of the level of political sophistication that is associated with Clinton. And later, when scandal erupts on a national level during his presidency, Toni Morrison referred to him as the first Black president. And this was no secret among African Americans. Of course, she knew that Bill Clinton was not indeed Black. But what she was referencing was a kind of mythological character in Black culture, a blues man. She saw Clinton as a weed-smoking, womanizing blues man with the law on his heels, who needed to be humbled and put in his place by his betters. And so in that moment, he is neither backward nor outside of time, but a man of his time. And I make that point to say that when cultural products or cultural phenomena enter our periphery, their meaning necessitates a negotiation of that meaning among the stakeholders. And so I do not mean to speak for all African Americans, but a segment of African Americans definitely saw features of African American culture in the way Bill Clinton positioned himself politically. But there are other ways of imagining. And I think it's important to understand that different or shifting perspective. And for that, I'll share a personal story. The photo that you see here is of me and my husband, Bernard, and his relative, Amber Bullock. Amber Bullock won the 4th season of a gospel competition show called Sunday Best. And this picture was taken at a celebration in her honor because she had won that competition. Bernard and I were seated at a table there. It was at someone's home. And there was a journalist there from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who had been covering Amber's career. And while I'm mentioning Amber Bullock, I want to say that if you want to have your wig blown off your head, Google Amber Bullock and For Every Mountain, and it will change your life. But I digress. Back to the topic at hand. We're being, the writer from, the journalist from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch is sitting at a table with Bernard and me, and he happens to ask where we're from. And when we say that we are from Arkansas, the look of disbelief on his face was just something he could not overcome. And he kept asking us questions because he could not reconcile that Arkansas could possess people who looked like us. Now, mind you, this was an African-American journalist. Also, you're probably aware that Missouri borders Arkansas, so we should not have seemed that foreign to him. But for whatever reason, he, I think, thought of us as somehow out of step with time, or he expected that we would be out of step with time. So Arkansas has long held this image of rurality, of poverty, of backwardness, of existing outside of time, and even to some degree, being a place that is dangerous and lawless, even in the 19th century, before its territorial, when it was a territory, before its statehood. And to some degree in the 20th century, if you remember the Banging in Little Rock series or documentary on HBO, I encountered people who were afraid of Arkansas because they thought it was overrun with gangs. I say that to say that the traits I am naming are not white traits by default, even though Arkansas is often imagined as a white place. I also say that because Black Arkansans don't typically write about hillbillies. So while the Blevins hypothesis of the hillbilly being significant to images of Arkansas, I do not dispute that. What I am saying is that there are other images in competition with that hillbilly image that are also engaging people on a national level. And oftentimes that comes from insider knowledge. And when I say this, the story I told is not unique to me. I've asked this question of students, what do people think of you when you travel and you tell them you're from Arkansas? And invariably somebody will say, I met my cousins in Chicago and they were surprised we had teeth and wore shoes. So this is something that is not unfamiliar to our native Arkansans. I'd like to share with you now a little bit about my research questions, my methodology, and the scope of my research. Essentially, the question that I'm asking in response to Blevins' work is, how do marginal people assert their citizenship, their sense of belonging in a hostile place? And Arkansas is not always hostile. But for the sake of our discussion tonight, I'll be talking about memoirs that depict Arkansas of African Americans during the time of Jim Crow. So we will examine it in terms of its hostility. I looked for marginal groups. I looked for the oral histories from slaves. I looked at women. I looked at queer Arkansans, and I wanted to centralize their experiences. Again, for tonight's talk, we're talking primarily about women. One of the things that helped to cement my research methodology was something I encountered with a scholar named Stacy Patton, who is also a child advocate. She said that we cannot fully understand race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and other experiences of oppression without acknowledging that it all revolves around the degraded status of the child, particularly how white supremacy intentionally targets all children for myriad degrees of destruction so that they grow up to underwrite the logics and horrors of discrimination. Patton's assertion of the degraded status of the child and its role in upholding white supremacy enables me to identify children as being among the most marginalized group when considered through other oppressive lenses, like gender, like race, like class, like sexuality. The common thread in the literature tonight is that each includes a depiction of Black childhood in Arkansas taking place during Jim Crow. So we have the Bill Dunks-Roman set in Arkansas, or the coming of age in Arkansas, oral histories published for a wide audience, memoir and fiction. My dissertation is organized chronologically, and tonight we're talking specifically about Jim Crow, Arkansas. I've listed here for you some of the women writers who are included in my study. And if for some reason you think I've omitted some African American Arkansan of note who should also be included, feel free to contact me. I would love it, because I want to do as comprehensive a study as is possible. So let's talk about what I found. I'll begin with the words of two women who were raised in Arkansas. Maya Angelou says, if growing up is painful for the Southern Black girl, being aware of her displacement is the rust on the razor that threatens the throat. It is an unnecessary insult. Daisy Bates wrote, my parents, as do most Negro parents, protected me for as long as possible from the inevitable insult and humiliation that is the South, that is in the South, part of being colored. So here we have people who, in their own words, understand themselves through the lens of the degraded state, through the lens of the degraded status of the Black girl child in Arkansas. Typically, the scholarship on trauma in the South has focused on survival or flight, as opposed to, as the only two reasonable responses to the trauma of the Jim Crow South. So the notion, what is opposed is the decision to either stay or to flee. In the memoirs depicting childhood during Jim Crow, the specter of lynching and mob violence is always present, and it informs how authors depict Arkansas as a significant place in their development. Scholar Trudier Harris and Guy Lancaster locate positions of danger for African Americans in the real and imagined South. Bell Hooks seeks to delineate positions of safety and resistance. So I'm going to talk about those people who are staying and then how they choose to remain safe and to resist. In her essay, Home Place, A Site of Resistance, Bell Hooks figures prominently in determining how Black subjects manage notions of safety during Jim Crow. She configures a concept called home place as a phenomenon within Black households that generates safe places from which to engage racial oppression. Hooks's theory challenges the notion that homemaking in Black homes performs the same social functions as in white ones. Her theory of home place is a feminist theory of placemaking that privileges the perspective of working class Black mothers. For her, Black mothering is a radical way, is radical for the way that it prepares children to resist racism, making the home a safe place to discuss their oppression. Unlike Farrah Griffin's safe place, which only occurs when Black Southerners flee the South, home place can happen anywhere nurturing occurs. In fact, Hooks sees home place as the foundation for building community, which is a heritage practice. And it's also a subversive cultural practice enacted by marginal people. Home place does not reveal its true purpose to outsiders. And Hooks's theory delineates examples of how African Americans imagine place differently than their white counterparts. Likewise, because home place emphasizes cultural practices, it is not reliant upon materiality in ways that built heritage practice is. And as a cultural theory, it's applicable in both the literary and the lived world. So it suited my purpose to deal with oral histories and also with fiction and memoir. So it was a very malleable concept. I'd like to talk a little bit about examples of trauma and then what they do. In Arkansas's Black South memoirs, a significant aspect of coming of age is the realization that parental protection of Black children is constrained by racism. Consequently, there is a strain of resultant trauma from this occurrence. Daisy Bates, for example, learns this lesson when she visits the local butcher, and he continues to serve white patrons ahead of her. And he sees her insistence on being served as an affront to the racial order. So she takes up the matter with her father. He explains that he can neither retaliate against the butcher nor protect the family from violent repercussions from the whites in Huttig, Arkansas. This revelation alters her temperament toward white people and fills her with a sense of righteous indignation. Her father's impotence in the face of racism brings into release his subsequent emasculation and displacement, which, due to her close bond with her father, also extends to her. And while he is old enough to understand the incident as part of how society works, Bates's entire worldview as a child is undone. She has accepted the degraded status of children as below adults, but is confounded by the additional layer of race as having the ability to undermine her father's authority. In contrast to Bates, Joycelyn Elder's childhood includes tolerant white neighbors. One such neighbor consistently encouraged her in her education, but nevertheless proudly referred to Elders as her little N-word girl. Though elders dismiss this moniker as a term of endearment, in her memoir, she later noted that she has likely blocked numerous incidents of racism from memory as a coping mechanism. Therefore, flight or escape in all its forms seem a reasonable response to trauma associated with a place, especially the Jim Crow South. And I should say that a substantial number of the women in the text describe trying to suppress racial trauma as a response to it, particularly Carlotta Walls Lanier, who deliberately didn't tell people that she had been part of the Little Rock Nine. And there, Maya Angelou went through a period of silence where she did not speak. And there are lots of instances where people found it hard to grapple with the impact of trauma, racial trauma as a result of Jim Crow. About the degraded status of children, I want to say that all children can be degraded in this model that Dr. Stacy Patton talks about. So the South had, during Jim Crow, an insistence on Black complicity with white supremacy. And in Growing Up Jim Crow, Jennifer Ritterhouse argues that the practice of indoctrinating white children to accept oppressive Southern social mores operated as a failsafe against racial interactions between Blacks and whites. It was a kind of indoctrination that was designed to teach white children to forget any possible alternatives to white supremacy. However, thanks to the memoirist who I'm studying, we do not forget what this time period was like. Melba Pattillo Beals, Carlotta Walls Lanier, and other memoirists do not allow us to forget this time period. Ritterhouse, citing IRving Goffman's performance paradigm, explains that Southern Blacks were expected to project willing deference and not draw attention to the asymmetrical power relationship between Blacks and whites. Thus, in narratives of racial conflict in the South, Black bodies in the presence of whiteness become text made readable by the white gaze. The text must always reinforce white supremacy by signaling inferiority. Moreover, Black survival depends upon the ability to anticipate a white supremacist outlook. So the parents of these children were, one of the strategies that they were teaching them were to appear to be invisible. So how does one create a sense of safety or autonomy in the face of racism? Through placemaking. Placemaking is, as I said, the ways that marginal people create spaces of safety and autonomy in response to racism. Because Black mobility in all its forms is counter-hegemonic, placemaking is linked to citizenship. So it's any assertion of equality or citizenship, and it can create great danger, but it can also be a source of great pleasure. And so I'll talk a bit about some of the examples that appear. One kind of placemaking is, as I've mentioned before, is through silence and camouflage. Primarily among the modes of defense employed in Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is bodily silence and camouflage. Angelou remarks about her grandmother, Mrs. Henderson. She didn't cotton the idea that white folks could be talked to at all without risking one's life, and certainly they couldn't be spoken to insolently, end quote. Due in part to Henderson's protection, Maya's home and community life are so insular that she rarely sees whites in her daily life. When she does encounter whites, not only is she not permitted to hold conversations with them, but the expectation is, with the exception of the white tenants who live on her grandmother's property, Angelou is unable to distinguish one white person from another as a child. She says, and I quote, "Most Black children didn't really absolutely know what whites looked like, other than that they were different, to be dreaded, and that in that dread was included the hostility of the powerful against the powerless," end quote. Maya and her brother Bailey are aware of their grandmother's expectation that they not draw negative attention of whites. Throughout the memoir, Henderson places herself in harm's way by speaking for the family in the face of white authority. There is one incident that occurs in the text where a white citizen comes and tells Mrs. Henderson that a lynch mob is looking for someone in particular. Angelou has a disabled uncle named Willie who helps to run the store and the family business and looks after her and her brother. And the grandmother hides Willie in the vegetable bins and covers him, literally with vegetables, and then covers him in prayer and shields him and stands guard over him until she knows that he is safe. So that's a passive kind of placemaking. There's also a confrontational kind of placemaking. And we see that employed in Bates's Long Shadow of Little Rock. In her memoirs, she talks about, and she uses her silence. It's a mode of silence. It's confrontational, but she uses it for vengeance. Bates learns at an early age that her biological mother was raped and murdered, and she identifies one of the culprits of the murder. And this person has a drinking problem. He sits on the porch of the commissary daily in a drunken stupor. And when she discovers him as a child, she's only like 6 or 7, she goes daily and stares him down to the point that he begs her to leave him alone. She doesn't say anything to him. She just stares at him. So this defiant posture, this daring to stare at him, to look her mother's killer in the face, is overwhelming to this man. Eventually he dies. And Bates perceives that his death is the result of her power. She has permanently expelled him from his post on the porch and of the commissary and ensured the suffering of a drunken rapist and murderer. She has dealt with the person who destabilized her biological family, and she has obtained justice that she would never find in the courts of Huddock, Arkansas. So her account of confrontational placemaking is fanciful and tantamount to a kind of exorcism. And it illustrates how nonverbal confrontation can establish equity or even justice from the marginal position of a Black girl child. So that kind of expelling or expulsion happens in other narratives as well. There is an exorcism that occurs in Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, where her grandmother, who is a landowner, she owns a business and property, and she has white tenant farmers who live on her farm. They come to the store and confront her. The children do. They have a hard time dealing with the fact that this Black woman has authority over them. And the grandmother, Mrs. Henderson, when she sees the children approaching, she knows they're up to mischief, and she sends Maya and her brother into the store and tells them to stay out of sight. So what happens is the children start to mock Mrs. Henderson. And Mrs. Henderson is a respected member of the Black community. People call her Mrs. Henderson. They show her a great degree of respect. And Maya watches from the safety of the store, really coming undone at the notion that someone would dare disrespect her grandmother. Children, Black or white, would dare disrespect her grandmother. So initially the grandmother stands silently and just looks at the children. And then she hums a tune, a spiritual. And as things escalate, the grandmother starts to sing in a low tone the words of the spiritual. Eventually, the standoff ends and the children depart. And so the subtext of this confrontational placemaking shows that Angelou's grandmother is using her Black body to act in defiance in front of perceived white authority. And this act prefigures nonviolent resistance. because as an adult, she would have authority to whip children, but we know that this would mean that violence could ensue. It epitomizes how this kind of nonviolent resistance can look like inaction to an outsider. Angelou's recollection of her own emotional distress while observing this incident bears witness to the dangerousness of the moment. Mrs. Henderson applies a form of sonic placemaking, invoking the sonic power of spirituals and the righteousness and respectability of Christianity to repel white oppression. She performs a kind of exorcism whereby the children who are taunting her can no longer abide the atmosphere she has created, the place she has made. So there's another kind of placemaking that can be dangerous, and that is the performance of parody or equality with whites. Several Black memoirists record Black student academic achievement being perceived as an affront to white supremacy. The Little Rock Nine writers all talk about it. Janice Kearney's Cotton Field of Dreams, she talks about integration and what that means to be academically competitive with whites. And so in Angelou's memoir, she tells a story about a community event of graduation at their local school and how everybody's excited. Every level of the community is participating, old and young, children from all grades. And the white superintendent comes, Miss Superintendent Dunleavy comes, and kind of disrupts the rhythm of the event. And one of the things that he does is he addresses the crowd. And in the face of this moment of Black excellence, Superintendent Dunleavy talks about the advancements that are being made at the white school, the academic advancements at the segregated white school. And when he talks about the Black school, he references athletic achievement as though they aren't there to celebrate a graduation. This is how Maya read the event. She says, from Dunleavy's remarks, we were maids, farmers, handymen, and washerwomen, and anything higher that we aspired to was farcical and presumptuous, end quote. In the wake of Dunleavy's address, the adults are grappling and the children are grappling to get their rhythm back, because as the program was, they were building to a climax, and he had sort of deflated everything that they were building toward, Mr. Dunleavy had. When suddenly Henry Reed, who is Angelou's classmate, starts to sing the words to the Negro National Anthem, and the crowd, the community joins him. And at that moment, they enthusiastically join him. And Angelou estimates that this was the necessary salve for the injury the community had suffered. Harmonious Black voices raised in unity against white supremacy enabled the entire community to reclaim the children's rightful social standing as academic achievers. It's important to emphasize that this community exists intact outside of a white gaze, and the act of placemaking occurs in response to it. Finally, I want to say, as I wrap up, we've looked at passive placemaking, confrontational placemaking, but there's also a form of group placemaking. And this happens by being a member of an insular group, of a family, of a church, of a segregated school, of community groups. Large families were particularly exemplary of this, the Kearney family and also Joycelyn Elder's family. Large families who have a insular culture of their own. And I'll say this, that in the literature that has been published before about Arkansas's image, elites take offense when someone says something negative about the state. And this is not the case with these insular African American communities because of the complicated relationship between the state and Black people. And so they were much more likely to be defensive about their community, their sibling group, people within their friend group, than they were to be offended because someone said Arkansas was backward or something of that nature. What I also found in the text was that when there was competition or contestation over space, it could prompt violence. The Little Rock Nine knew this. You've all seen the footage of Elizabeth Eckford's first day of school, or perhaps even seen the iconic picture. In the Kearney family, her father had to pull a shotgun on a white farmer who was plowing up her yard, their backyard, literally taking away property that was meant for his family to plow and plant someone else's crops on. And her brother, Julius, integrated the Tasty Freeze in their town and ended up getting into a fight with the local sheriff. Several of the stories involve cases where white men came into Black neighborhoods to try to sexualize or sexually solicit Black girls, young Black girls. So, and the way that that the girls were able to escape was through the threat of violence. So I've talked about how Arkansas can be a place of trauma, but I need to also say that Arkansas can be a place of healing. Maya Angelou comes to Arkansas from St. Louis after having experienced a very traumatic sexual assault, and stamps Arkansas is the place that heals her. It's the community that receives her. It's where she literally obtains her voice again and begins to love literature. Her love for words is born in that place. The Kearney family reunions. Janice Kearney comes from a family of 19 children. They routinely met over the years and had annual reunions, which have now become a reunion for the township of Gould, Arkansas, and not just that family. And lastly, Arkansas is a place worth redeeming. Although several of the people that I studied, including Richard Wright and Maya Angelou, left Arkansas and then rarely returned or never returned, I think in the case of Richard Wright. Others came to stay. And they came to make improvements in the place that was their home. Daisy Bates, Joycelyn Elders, Janice Kearney, and the late writer Elin Harris all came back to Arkansas to do work here. So in summary, here's what I found that links all the narratives on childhood or girlhood in Arkansas during Jim Crow. The narratives or memoirs represent counter narratives. They correct and fill in gaps in history or perceptions, particularly of the Little Rock Nine, who felt like their memoirs needed to set the record straight on more popular, more palatable versions of what had happened at Central. They reflect intersectional identities through the degraded status of the child. The notion of home place fosters activism and resistance. The mothers and community members dare to create or raise children who are valued. And their value, this intrinsic knowledge of their value, means that they resist oppression. There's a sense of belonging. And because these are narratives of survival or living through the Jim Crow experience, common themes of survival, Black excellence, education, the merits of Christian values, racial awareness, familial and racial responsibility, the notion that one owes something to one's community, overcoming poverty, racism, sexual assault, and threats of racial violence run throughout these texts about girlhood or childhood in Arkansas. And I think that's my very last slide. Yes. So that's the end of my talk. And I'm going to see if Guy will join us and if we have any questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. And folks, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat and we'll get to them. I have one question to start with.
Okay.
Because, you know, you talking about you were in St. Louis and the story at the beginning, the gospel competition.
Mhm.
And I think that's an experience Arkansans have of, you know, I was in Cleveland and mentioned someone, you know, that I'd just driven up from Arkansas, and he said, well, how long did that take? And I said something like 12 hours. And he said, but Arkansas is just right next to Georgia, isn't it? You know, that people out there have no awareness whatsoever. But on the flip side, you know, when you're at the periphery, you have to be aware of what's at the center. You know, like many people out in the world don't know where Arkansas is, but I bet, you know, Arkansans could name many of the boroughs of New York City, for example, you know.
Mhm.
And, you know, so there's that, when you're at the periphery, you have to be aware of what's at the center. And that works not just with region, but with race also. You know, many writers have talked about how, you know, African Americans have to know white people better than they know themselves to some extent. And, you know, I wonder, does this create sort of a dual marginalization, or does the fact of already being, you know, at the margins due to race sort of render the other moot?
In these insular communities, the narratives that I'm reading, you know, the memoirs and things, they do not understand themselves as marginal based solely on race, sometimes based on poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But race alone, no. I couldn't talk, you know, in the time span, I couldn't go as specific as I would want. But one of the things that happens is like parents insist on mediating the contact of their children during Jim Crow with white people. It's like in Janice Kearney's biography, her memoir rather, she talks about how she was isolated at home, and this man approached her because he saw that she was isolated. So she didn't understand herself in the same way that he is perceiving her. Mm-hmm. And that she had no reason to think less of herself, or she didn't see herself as degraded until those moments of contact with people who would want to degrade her. That's the point I'm making.
Okay. Is there a difference between how men versus women in your study represent the state?
That's a really good question.
Because you mentioned Richard Wright left, and, you know, I was thinking also William Pickens, you know, bolted and had rather negative take on Arkansas, you know, that. And is it that the men are more mobile, perhaps?
What I found was that Wright in particular was really focused on leaving. And it wasn't just place that he felt oppressed through. And I didn't get to emphasize this, but I'm glad for your question. Some people felt that being in the South also made them racially oppressed. Mm-hmm. I'm not racially oppressed, religiously oppressed. They dealt with dogma that was just too much for them. Mm-hmm. And they really wanted to get out from under that. For Wright in particular, his family was in a particular religious sect that was very strict. And the things that intrigued him they seem to want to stifle him. He couldn't be creative. He couldn't read fiction. Um, and so he was being monitored everywhere, at home and outside of home. And that made things kind of difficult for him. I'm thinking about him in terms of the other men in my study happen to be queer men of color. And they were writing stories about queer experiences in Arkansas. And it was very restrictive, as you would imagine. Yeah, that's the thing that I'm recalling. I can't say with any certainty that theirs is very different, because it doesn't seem like I'm comparing the same kinds of relationships.
I was just thinking too, many writers, you know, Black male writers talk about Jim Crow restrictions as kind of very emasculating too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if there's something analogous within, you know, from the perspective of female writers, you know, maybe not emasculating, but more it's these strictures are a threat to communal bonds or threats to family.
They talk more about the notion of being humiliated, like not being able to, people trying to rob them of their dignity. Mm-hmm. And there is this, there's always, it seems, a core group of women who insist on the preservation of dignity in the women. Mm-hmm. And it's part of what makes them thrive. I think that's part of home plates. If we were to look at it more closely, these women have, women have people in their lives who are insisting on their value. Mm-hmm. With the men that I wrote about, it's coming to me now that I can think about this. What they are dealing with are micromanaging their behaviors. People who are trying to shut down what they think are expressions of queerness, and they meet that with violence. So there are nurturing figures in their lives, but not always as nurturing as they could be. They often find the nurturer later as adults, but as children, they're being policed.
Right.
Yes, I think that's a very good term for what I'm seeing. They're being policed as children.
Which has to be, you know, sort of already being policed as a Black male and then being policed as, you know, a queer person.
And so that's what I mean by the kind of the various intersections of oppression and the degraded status of the child. So when you add poor, Black, and then you add queer, or you add poor, Black, and girl, and even poor, Black, and boy, you know, you add those things together, it becomes more burdensome. And then put Jim Crow on top of that, you know, and just it becomes very difficult. So it was wonderful to these are stories about triumph against, you know, just astounding odds in every case, particularly with Wright, who, and some of these writers know tremendous hunger. When you talk about poverty, they understand hunger, because Jim Crow is happening oftentimes before, before free lunch programs and things of that nature. So if there's not like financial security in the home, then in addition to all of these other things, they're thinking about their own stability. The children are laborers, co-laborers with their parents, and they help to support the family. That's part of what I meant when I was saying that there's a sense of obligation to your community or to your family unit they understand that there's something that they have to do.
Well, there is a comment from Janice Kearney saying, "Thank you, Carmen, for honoring me and other Black women writers. I wonder if you saw any difference in women's reactions to race based on age or what part of the state they lived in."
Interestingly enough, Joycelyn Elders, Dr. Elders, she didn't think that the region of the state where she was particularly difficult racially to live in. Her family had good working relationships with her white neighbors. The Delta region and Little Rock were, perhaps it was the time period as well, but they showed a great deal of tension between people of different races in their upbringing whenever there was a kind of contested space where the potential for violence was.
Got another question. The strength of Maya Angelou's grandmother is so memorable in Caged Bird. Do you see that character in other works by Black women?
Yes, yes. Particularly Melba Patillo Beals had I want to call her, she wasn't a pistol packing grandmother, but one of the things her grandmother did, both her grandmother and her mother were exemplary women, and they instilled in her a sense of excellence and racial pride. And the grandmother actually took shifts with a shotgun to watch over her at night when the family home was being attacked. And so there are lots of these amazing maternal figures who stand in the gap. And one of the things I liked about Janice Kearney's mother is that her description of her is that she and the father would have this discussion periodically about whether the children would work to help the family or go to school. And the mother was like, hey, these kids need an education, and they're going to get an education if it means you're going to have to tutor them. And so the father agreed to tutor the children so that they could get their education and make sure they didn't fall behind in their studies. So that kind of thing, that happens a lot in these narratives where mothers are, and even Joycelyn Elders' mother and grandmother insisted that she be allowed to pursue higher education, even when it wasn't convenient for the family. It was a hardship not to have her to help with the farm labor, but she had women who were advocating for her education, and saw to it that she was able to go on to high school and even to college.
Got a few questions here. Do you see this project evolving into one book project or more than one? And if more than one, what different foci would these works take?
I would love to just get one book first. There are other aspects of this. Like, I haven't looked at music as a cultural artifact, but I would love to look at the music that African American Arkansans are making. Henry Dumas, who he was from Arkansas and wrote about, a lot of his poetry is pastoral and deals with nature. And it comes from his experiences growing up as a boy in Arkansas. And there's scholarship about him, but his books are not in wide circulation anymore. And I would really love to do more work on him. Rashad Ollison wrote a memoir that was just so amazing about the role of music in his life in Arkansas. And it connects to his relationship with his father. And I only got to scratch the surface of that in the dissertation. So there are places I would like to go, but first we have to get to the book stage, and we're not quite there yet.
I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, Carmen. I'd love to hear you talk of the agency of both grandmothers in Maya's narrative. even more than men in her childhood, one in Arkansas, the other in St. Louis, and the grandmother in St. Louis was the one who made sure the man who raped her received justice.
Yes. Yes. So there is a difference in the two sides of Maya Angelou's family. The St. Louis grandmother is involved in criminal enterprise, and respectability politics is not really her thing. Whereas in a lot of the other narratives where there are women, there's this connection to church and a sort of church morality that is very significant to their upbringing. But her St. Louis grandmother was not from that camp. And yes, she did make sure that the man who had assaulted Maya Angelou was harmed. He was murdered, and probably by one of Maya's uncles, it's believed. So yes, not everybody was a devout Christian. Not everybody subscribed to the notion of respectability or politics. But Angelou's St. Louis grandmother was, they were kind of affluent for a time because of the kind of businesses that they ran, and they lived very well. And so it afforded them quite a luxurious life in comparison to some other of the people in my study.
Got a comment here. Thank you for this beautiful presentation. I appreciate learning about these women writers from Arkansas. It makes me want to reflect more on my own experiences growing up in northwestern Arkansas. I would say my experiences were different. However, many people I encounter today are still surprised that I'm an educated Black woman who grew up in Fayetteville. Blessings to you from Tammy Michelle Perry.
Yes, yes, that's wonderful. Yeah, yeah.
And lots of praise for you. This has been a rich conversation. And again, Janice Kearney says, thank you for sharing. TJ and Ethel were truly special.
I have had the benefit of coming from a very, well, it's a relatively large family. There were 8 siblings. And so when I read these stories from Janice Kearney and Joycelyn Elders, I can see very much similarity in my own life, and even Angelou's life. And to some degree, even the Little Rock Nine. There are certain things that Grits, girls raised in the South, have a common understanding of if you're of a certain age. And so reading their stories felt very personal to me. And so it was a pleasure to delve into this notion of Arkansas writers for a dissertation. It didn't even really feel like a labor, except a labor of love. So
you've hung around. You must feel that Arkansas is redeemable.
Sure. Yes. It's home for me. I understand the tension that exists between African Americans and living in the South, even in the rural South, and what that means, what struggles that entails rather. But there is a very strong familial connection for me here with my husband's family as well as my biological family. My family has been in Arkansas for over 100 years. And my brothers own a farm that's been in our family for 130 years. And
got some family from Earl area, right?
From Earl, from Crawfordsville. My father grew up in Earl, my mother in Crawfordsville, near Marion, Arkansas, Crittenden County. And that's home for me. People look at the Delta and see a depressed area. And when I see those crops coming up in the spring, I get real excited. It looks very beautiful to me. And I never get tired of the flat landscape that you can see for 20 miles. That doesn't bother me. And the sunsets are amazing here.
Look, my grandparents, my dad's family's from Parkin, so just down the road from Earl.
Yes.
I think I understood something about the Delta because growing up in Eastern Arkansas, I became very fascinated with variations in geography, like, ooh, hills and mountains are just wonderful.
Yes.
But I asked my grandmother once if you know wouldn't she just want to move somewhere, have a nice mountain cabin or something, and she said, oh no, I want to be where I can see what all my neighbors are doing. But that's kind of part of it, that you know keeping track of everyone, being able to keep up with everyone, what everyone's doing, that flatness sort of builds a community in some respects.
It does. And I absolutely believe that there is much redeemable in Arkansas. And I think it behooves those of us who are from here to do whatever we can to make it better than it was when we got here. How can we make this better?
Well, I think with that, we're going to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone who tuned in and submitted some good questions and comments. In a week's time, we'll be talking with another Heritage Studies graduate, Alicia O'Neill, about the works of Charlie May Simon. So, Carmen, it has been fantastic seeing you again.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
One day I'll be up in Jonesboro again, or you down here, and
And I'd like to say thank you for the people who joined also.
Yeah, thank everyone who joined, and have a good evening, have a good week. Take care of yourself and stay safe out there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.